So good morning everyone, and welcome to this webinar on using data to understand child poverty at local level. Thanks very much for joining us today. If anyone's having any problems with the technology, if you can't hear us or you can't see us, then you can use the questions function to ask Lynn Sharp, who's managing the technical side of things today, for assistance. You can also use that chat function to ask any questions of speakers, but we will come back to the questions after all the speakers have had their turn. And we should have about 25 minutes at that point to go through the questions and have some discussion. So I'll just run through the agenda for this morning. Before I do, I want to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, so no swearing, and we'll make it available to everyone that's registered and publish it on YouTube over the next few days. So up first today, we'll have Professor John McKendrick of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit based at Glasgow Caledonian University. He'll be talking through some of the sources of local data on child poverty and their limitations. Secondly, we'll have Dr. Megan Watson from Public Health Scotland. She'll introduce a new collection of resources entitled Prioritising Child Poverty, a Data and Systems Approach, which has been developed in partnership with Inverclyde Council. And finally, we'll have Gena Howe from Glasgow City Council, and she'll be talking about work taken forward in partnership with the Centre for Civic Innovation, which is using locally sourced data, including housing benefit and council tax reduction information, to build a picture of the extent and depth of child poverty in Glasgow. So before I hand over to the speakers, I'll introduce myself and just say a few words about the purpose of the webinar. My name's Hanna McCulloch, and I'm the National Coordinator for Local Child Poverty Action Reports with the Improvement Service. That role involves supporting local government and health boards with the implementation of local child poverty action reports and sharing good practice around what can be done to reduce child poverty at local level. So why did we decide to use this webinar to focus on data and child poverty today? Well, clearly having access to the right data is an important part of ensuring that local partners can take the most effective action to tackle child poverty. Understanding the prevalence of child poverty in a local area, its location and its depth, helps us to build an understanding of the scale of the problem, the extent of need, and how to target our resources effectively. Data can also help build a picture of the opportunities and the barriers that might exist for families by telling us about the conditions in the local area, like the availability of jobs, of childcare, the cost and affordability of housing and transport. And data on the population is also vital. We know that certain household types are significantly at higher risk of experiencing child poverty. So the 6 priority groups that are highlighted in the local guidance, those are lone parent households, families with 3 or more children, families that have a baby under 1, BME households, households in which someone is disabled, and households in which the mother is aged 25 or under, are far more likely to experience child poverty. So considering the prevalence and location of those groups in the local area can help us to build a better understanding of their needs and the kind of support that might be effective, as well as getting an understanding of whether we're managing to reach them with services and support. Although it's important to say at this point that engaging with people with lived experience of poverty is obviously also integral to that, and we don't have time to go into that aspect of things today, but hopefully we can talk about that at another webinar in the future. The other thing that data can potentially do, of course, is to help us track progress and change in rates of poverty over time. And that's something I just wanted to talk about in a wee bit more detail, because it's probably the question that I get asked most in relation to data and child poverty. So the question relates to the Child Poverty Scotland Act 2017. And as many of you know, that Act sets ambitious targets for the reduction of child poverty in Scotland against 4 key income-based measures to be achieved by 2030, with interim targets set for the year 2023-2024. And what I wanted to highlight is that there's not currently the data available at local level to establish local progress against the majority of these particular measures. And John McKendrick will go into that in more detail and probably with more clarity. But I also wanted to highlight that the duty on local authorities and health boards under the Child Poverty Act isn't necessarily to meet those targets in their local area. Some areas might already have surpassed the interim targets, some may have a lot further to go than others. And the legislative duty is rather to report on what is being done at local level, what local partners plan to do to contribute to the meeting of those targets at national rather than local level. So while we would always encourage local partners to have those targets at the forefront of their mind and to act in a strategic way that will impact those figures over time by increasing family income and reducing family outgoings, there's no need to be overly focused or fixated on identifying the data that establishes progress towards those 4 targets at local level. Instead, when we're thinking about the effect that actions are having, local partners might want to focus more on the data that is available or which they can collect, and indeed the monitoring and evaluation of their policies to understand the reach and impact that they're having. And this should help local partners both reassure and challenge themselves that they are doing everything that they can to contribute to those targets at national level, and most importantly, to lift as many children as possible out of poverty. I hope that makes some sort of sense. We'll certainly have time to come back to it in the questions, and I'm sure John will also touch upon it. Okay, so now we can hand over to the first speaker, which is Professor John McKendrick of the Scottish Poverty and Inequality Research Unit. Thanks, John.
Talking about teeny tiny use, a little use, and mission critical. And this refers to 3 data geographies. If we could move on to the next slide. So the 3 data geographies I want to touch upon are national data that can be disaggregated to the local level, and local data. And I just want to draw a conclusion at the end. So let's talk about national data to start with, if we move on to the next slide. Now, Hannah's mentioned then that the driver behind these local focus and the local action reports as the Child Poverty Act of 2017. And it sets these 4 targets. Now, I'm not going to dwell on these 4 targets, but Hannah made a really important point in the introduction there, that what we don't have is we don't have local data that allows us to measure 3 of these 4 targets. We don't have local data to measure absolute poverty, combined low income and material deprivation, and persistent poverty. Now, with relative poverty, I'm going to go on to say a little bit more about that, but it's not the objective, as Hannah says, that we locally, over the next 10 years, as we move towards 2030, we measure these 4 targets. If we move on to the next slide. So what the national data, the Scotland level data for Scotland as a whole gives us is figures such as this. Big numbers, 240,000 children in Scotland, 2/3 living in a household with at least 1 adult in work. It gives us a sense of what the scale of the national challenge is. Let's move on to the next slide. So this, my descriptor then, it's teeny tiny use in terms of what the local areas should be concerned with. This annual release of the Scottish data from the households below average income tends now to be released in March each year. Now, it is teeny tiny use, so I'm not saying it's not at all useful. It might be useful locally if we need to inform those that are minded about the national state of affairs. You know, if we have people in the local areas that believe their responsibility is to contribute to these national goals, or if we flip that on its head, or for those that locally are primarily concerned with local issues, but they need to know how these local actions are shaped by local priorities, then it's useful for us to understand these national data, not the local data, the national data. But what it doesn't do really is it helps us shape local poverty actions. It just gives us a sense of that big picture. If we move on. But even amongst those that want to have that sense of understanding how the local relates to the national, we must remember there are many people that have different views about poverty locally. Some won't think it's a problem. Some people will think it's a problem, but it's actually poor people are to blame for the poverty they experience. Others at the other side of the spectrum would blame hidden hands and vested interest and perhaps the way that capitalism works, and that's why we've got poverty. So even these national poverty data are not necessarily going to land and make a difference to people locally. They will make a difference to those who believe that our anti-poverty interventions are not good enough, and that what we have to do is we have to make them work better. So I think it's an important point to note that these national data are not going to influence everybody locally, but they might have an influence for some. So let's move on. Now, these are the types of national data that can be disaggregated locally. And what we have here is a kind of league table approach. These are data from the End Child Poverty Collective, which gives us an estimate, and I have to emphasize an estimate, of the extent to which child poverty prevails across the 32 local authorities in Scotland. Let's move, and I don't want to dwell on the data here. Let's move on to the next slide. So we have a range of these national data that can be disaggregated locally so that we could perhaps benchmark, compare, understand, and perhaps to a degree track changes through time. We have the HMRC have an estimate of the relative child poverty data measured in a before housing costs measure. Now, I won't get too technical. We can come back to that in questions if we need to explore further. A similar type of data is produced by the End Child Poverty Collective, which use the HMRC data, but then factor in some modelling to give an after housing costs estimate of child poverty, which is the way in which we measure poverty in the 2017 Child Poverty Act. But there are a whole set of other national data that can be disaggregated locally as well. Not poverty, but the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation gives us a sense of collections of deprivation, again, not poverty, but a concept related to poverty for small areas. Free school meal registrations are reported on each year annually, which gives us a school-based level, as well as being aggregated to the local authority level. Benefits data, likewise, can be available locally. These are national data, can be disaggregated locally. There are other data zone-based data, the data zone being that small unit of data collection that we use in Scotland. And of course, we have the Scottish Government's local child poverty dashboard, which pulls together a range of key data and allows us to collect or present these data for different local authorities. Now, I'm saying these are of a little use, these national data that can be disaggregated locally, because they can also be a distraction. We can get sidetracked with league tables, become more focused in relative position and where we are. I think one thing that's worth acknowledging, they can also be wasteful of local leads' time, because it can lead to questions being asked, why are we not making progress despite the investment that we are making to tackle child poverty locally? Why is our overall level of child poverty not being reduced? Or why is child poverty in X authority lower than in Y authority? So it can actually be a draw on our time and a distraction from what we are aiming to do. And I think the important point there is, of course, it can be a misleading evidence of local impact. Now, it's a harsh lesson, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that our control over child poverty locally is limited. We still have no control locally over national taxation. We have no control locally over welfare benefits and the level at which they are remunerated. So we don't have control over two of the key levers which impact upon child poverty, and therefore to use national data to evidence how effective our local impact is can be highly problematic. So these national data that can be disaggregated locally can also be problems. Let's move on. But we might, as I say, they may be of a little use because they can allow us to evidence the scale of the problem locally, and they often are in the local child poverty action reports. And because things change through time, and we'd like to think when we're having these webinars in 2028, the type of discussion we'll be having will be different to the one we're having today, because we'd like to think the actions we're taking locally and nationally will be reducing child poverty. So we have to understand the nature of that local poverty at any given time. And as I say, I'd like to think that the poverty in your backyard will be very different in a few years' time than it is today. They can help us inform local actions, and they can allow us to build a case for funding. But the critical question, do these national data that can be disaggregated locally, do they tell us if we are making a difference? We can move on to the next slide. So those of you who are up with your children's stories will recognise this from the Emperor's New Clothes. And the key point is they don't. These national data disaggregated locally, giving estimates of relative child poverty in a local area, don't tell us whether our local actions are effective. And that's I think the key worry that we have is that we begin to misuse these data, that if there's no significant progress and reduction in the local data, it somehow tells us that we're doing the wrong things locally. Remember the point I made about taxation. Remember the point I made about social security. So let's move on to think about the local, which of course is going to be the focus of the next two presentations. But if we move on to the next slide. This is what's mission critical. Not looking at national data, not looking at how national data is disaggregated locally, but thinking about the local issues that we need to focus on. And as I say, the next two presentations with Gena and Megan will build upon this. This is where our energy is best spent locally. Then here are just 5 examples of the types of data that we need for evidence-based policy making, incorporating budget issues, oversight of programmes, monitoring programmes, evaluating specific programmes, or looking at generally the effectiveness of public programmes. Let's move on. Now, as Gena and Megan will say, it's not straightforward. There are challenges we have to face in using these local data. They have to be resourced. There has to be the local skills to enable the right conclusions to be drawn. It broadens out the range of people who are involved in collecting data, reflecting in data, and making decisions with data, budgetary being one example there. There has to be buy-in to it that we believe it's worthwhile. And I think also we have to be prepared to let go, because if evaluation is purposeful, it might mean that we are disinvesting from areas that we previously had invested in. And Gena and Megan are going to give a couple of exemplars about what that might involve. But let me move on and let me just conclude on this introductory presentation. So what we need to do is, in terms of data, we need a shift in focus to local intelligence for local actions. National data have a very limited and specific contribution to make, but that's all they are. The local has to be the focus of our concerns. And that gives us a couple of issues, I think, in terms of national data we have to resolve. How can we evidence progress without determining this by league table positions and trends? And secondly, what do we really need from the Scottish Government? Now, we have that local government, the dashboard of local areas, but we need to think about whether we really need effort to be invested by the government analysts in generating these data and keeping us up to date. And I look forward, if there are any questions at the end of the presentation, to discussing some of the issues I've raised. Thanks, Hanna.
Thanks very much, John. And yeah, just a reminder, if you do have questions for John, just use the question button to type those in, and we can read those out and get back to them after all the speakers have had their turn. Okay, so I'll now hand over to Dr. Megan Watson from Public Health Scotland.
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks, John, for both of your presentations that have given a really good context and a reflection on some of the issues that we're trying to address here. So, good morning, everyone. In 2019, myself and colleagues from the Public Health Observatory and the local intelligence support teams in Public Health Scotland worked with partners in Inverclyde to pilot using a public health needs assessment process to make better use of local and national data in the planning, monitoring and evaluation of actions to tackle child poverty. I'm delighted to join this webinar today to finally launch a package of resources that we've co-produced from this work. Okay, Lynn, can we have the first slide, please? We know that living in poverty is a significant factor driving ill health, and we know that getting it right in the early years is crucial to ensure that all children thrive, living healthy and happy lives in childhood and throughout the life course. At Public Health Scotland, we have a clear commitment to supporting Scotland's ambitions to reduce the number of children living in and at risk of poverty. The work we're presenting today is just one of the key ways we have been working with local areas to support and strengthen actions to address child poverty by supporting the better use of data. Next slide, please. One of the challenges is that child poverty is a complex public health problem with a complex system of interventions and mitigations in place. There is no one-stop shop to compile all the relevant data. The local child poverty action reports produced by each of the local authorities are providing a wealth of information about what is happening at a local level to address child poverty. But we realise that this has been by no means a simple and straightforward information gathering task, and has presented several challenges, including information sharing between internal and external stakeholders, a lack of appropriate data collection systems, and sometimes a feeling of being a bit lost in the data. At a national level, we wanted to learn from this process and work with local authorities to support the use of local and national data to assess trends in child poverty and the activities to address these, with the aim of being able to provide services and interventions that are targeted to address the biggest need at a local level. Next slide, please. The purpose of the local reports shouldn't be about ticking boxes or a repetitive data gathering task that is a burden to pull together each year just before the deadline. For these reports to be really effective, they should be integrated into our way of working. They should be a catalyst to embed a local child poverty system where partners have a shared understanding of the scale of child poverty and their role in reducing it, which should lead to a system that knows what's going on to address child poverty locally and what needs to change. This is what we were trying to test in Inverclyde, is a participatory public health needs assessment approach, a practical method to support the development of a local child poverty system and embed the practice of data-driven planning, monitoring, evaluation and improvement. Next slide, please. This is a brief outline of the approach we took in Inverclyde to support them with understanding, planning and prioritising their child poverty actions. We've learned a lot and have tried to incorporate this learning into a package of resources to support others. The process began by focusing on trying to understand the local system through participatory family-focused workshops with local partners. During this, we started to explore the data already gathered, used and shared within the system. In the understanding the data phase, we built on this by combining what we learned from the system with data that we knew other local authorities were using and what was nationally available. Then we moved on to supporting the use of data by helping Inverclyde populate the sources we had discovered as being available and relevant to local child poverty, interpreting the data to tell the story from it, and supporting local partners to prioritise actions in the areas that the data suggested would have the biggest impact. And finally, we're in the sharing the learning phase, where we've developed a package of resources to guide others through the process we undertook in Inverclyde. Next slide, please. The first resource in this package is an animation that we have developed at the request from other local child poverty leads to provide a brief overview of our approach and what difference it's made. And this is to be used by them and others to engage local senior officials and partners in discussions about adopting or adapting a similar approach locally. And I'll ask Lynn to show the animation now, as it should give you more of a flavour of the work.
Child poverty is a public health issue. It negatively impacts health in childhood and into adulthood. The economic and social environment over which children and families often have little control causes or drives child poverty. A public health approach to reduce child poverty has the potential for impact by targeting actions to address the main drivers of poverty, preventing families from being locked into poverty. This animation describes how Public Health Scotland and Inverclyde Child Poverty Action Group worked together to explore how national and local data sources could be used to help identify priorities and develop actions to reduce local child poverty.
The partners involved in Inverclyde Child Poverty Action Group understand the many challenges that comes with improving outcomes around child poverty. We wanted to look at the ways that we could work better together, be more collaborative and improve the partnership working. We wanted to create better choices and chances for families experiencing and living in poverty in Inverclyde. After a conversation with the national partners, it was clear to the members of the Inverclyde Child Poverty Action Group that we needed to understand the systems we were working in. We needed to know where the gaps were and the areas of duplication, and we wanted to understand the data that we gathered locally and the information that this data provided. We wanted to conduct a deep data dive, working as one rather than as individual service providers.
In our work, we took a public health participatory needs assessment approach. This assesses the challenges a particular population might face, what their needs might be, what existing support is available, and where there are gaps. We did this to find out what data is and isn't available to support child poverty actions. First, we needed to understand the system and know who the key players were in addressing child poverty. Working with local child poverty leads, we identified key local public and third sector services that have a role to play in the drivers of child poverty. We asked them to identify individuals who knew how these services ran and what data and information they collected and used. Public Health Scotland developed 2 workshops to lead members of these services through the needs assessment, ensuring sign-off from the Community Planning Partnership, elected members and senior officials to pilot this work. In the first workshop, we took a family-centred approach to understand the services that might be needed to support one family at risk of child poverty. We met Claire, 22, and her 3-year-old son Jake, and looked at what their journey through and between the local services might be like. We used the first workshop to develop an understanding of what the local child poverty system looked like and how complex it was. We got the stakeholders to map out the different information that each service would hold and use to support Claire and Jake, and what else they would need to know to better support them. Then, participants described current pathways between their services. This allowed us to see what Claire and Jake's journey looked like, what was missing, and how it felt to be trapped constantly repeating the same story. The second workshop aimed to think about data within the context of Inverclyde's child poverty system, specifically population profile information to help understand the local population specific to child poverty and information about each of the 3 drivers of child poverty. We reviewed this data and asked 3 key questions. What can Inverclyde replicate? In other words, replicate data as we know this data exists in another local authority. What else can Inverclyde add? What's missing to tell the most complete story of actions to address child poverty in Inverclyde? From this discussion, we created a resource with a list of potential data sources, where to find them, what they can and can't tell us, and how they can be used to describe the local child poverty picture. Inverclyde reported 3 main benefits from this process: a better understanding of the local child poverty system, improved professional relationships, and a shared understanding of roles, a better understanding of data and how to use it to produce a range of key performance indicators and evidence-based child poverty priorities, a focus on families in need and understanding what's important to them and how to best support them. Understanding the complex system surrounding families in need and working with the data already available within that system provided a more complete picture of the factors influencing child poverty locally. This helped Inverclyde focus their resources for greater impact.
Working with Public Health Scotland on this pilot gave us an opportunity to have the space for local colleagues to understand our local capacity and our resources. It provided us with discussions and space to help us better understand the needs of our community, to set our priorities, and we would like to thank you for this. Thank you.
Our aim is to change the way we approach child poverty, and we hope this pilot will help other areas make better use of data and information to plan their local child poverty actions, identify priorities, and assess the impact of actions. Public Health Scotland is committed to providing support for the ongoing planning, monitoring and evaluation of local child poverty systems. If you think your local area would benefit from this process, we have a package of resources that could support you.
So sitting alongside the animation, we have a set of resources to help local areas work through the understanding the system stages, as well as the understanding the data stages. These resources go together, but can stand alone and can be used as and when local areas find it beneficial. For example, the workshops alone helped Inverclyde develop a better understanding of what the local system supporting families at risk of child poverty looked like and what was working well as what could be improved. The family-focused approach helped participants understand how these families might be feeling and what else they might need to truly support them. And the workshops developed and strengthened networks, helping individual services see where they fit into the puzzle. The workshop resources included in the package are workshop templates with a step-by-step guide, pen portraits to help people move from a mindset of we don't have data to how are we helping families like this, example process maps to aid in the mapping of family experiences through the system, and slide sets that local partners can adopt and adapt for local use to explain the context of child poverty and set the scene for a shared understanding between the partners. So for local areas that are maybe not in the place to be doing intensive data work, the first workshop alone could provide helpful in its own right. Similarly, we know that the need for support with data is strong, and that's why we're all here today at this webinar. So we recognise that areas might want to go straight to the workbook, and they should find it still useful to them. The workbook presents a variety of data sources relevant to child poverty, including detail on where to find them, what they can and can't tell us, and how they can help. However, to get the best results, we strongly encourage local areas to set up their own workshops, inviting a wide range of service providers and partners in order to better understand their own local system and therefore tailor the data sources to their own situation. The data used to tell the story of local child poverty is very much dependent on what we know about the local system. Each local area is likely to be unique in its own right, so we might be telling an inaccurate or incomplete story if we just pick up the data sources workbook and use it. They might have several data sources that aren't included because they weren't identified in Inverclyde, and so could identify priorities that miss key local needs. Can I just get you to move on once, please, Lynn? We also include a note on engaging with and using lived experience throughout this process within the package of resources. Unfortunately, due to the timing of this work, we were unable to progress our plans around lived experience, although partners locally have engaged separately. We include some examples of the types of questions we might have asked at different points in the process to ensure that lived experience inform the needs assessment throughout the whole process. And we would encourage other areas to feed this in right from the start. Next slide, please, Lynn. Apologies if this isn't clear for some of you, but I just wanted to give you a brief idea of what the data sources workbook looks like. Lynn, can you press the play button, please? Thank you. You can each explore it in more time by visiting our web pages, and the link is at the end of these slides, but will also be out on Twitter later today and will be emailed out when the slides, the recording of this webinar comes out. So we include a brief overview of the workbook and then provide a list of potential sources that were developed through the pilot with Inverclyde. We've sorted these indicators that might help you understand your local population, specifically those experiencing or at risk of child poverty, as well as by each of the three main drivers of child poverty. As you can see, there's a wealth of potential sources here with information and advice to guide how you use them locally. We also include a final tab which helps you identify local authorities that you can use as comparators, drawing on the improvement service family groupings. Okay, Lynn, if you just move on to the next slide, please. This approach was a different way of doing things. It took time and resources to bring people together and spend time really thinking about child poverty and what really needed to happen to make a difference. We fully explained and sought buy-in from senior leaders and officials within the local areas prior to starting our groundwork so that we could encourage engagement throughout those levels. We had engagement with services that hadn't all been in a room together before and some that hadn't considered their role in child poverty before. While it could have been perceived as resource intensive, the feedback locally has been that it was crucial in developing stronger local partnerships and a shared ownership of the responsibility of addressing child poverty. Inverclyde have also used the data and the narrative produced as evidence for their priorities in their annual reports, as well as for how to spend 1.5 million anti-poverty funding. Next slide, please. This has been a very quick overview of what we've done and the resources that we're launching today. I've included a link here to the resources page on our website and invite you all to take some time to look around these pages and the resources there. The resources have been designed for use locally and they should not require any specialist support to use. However, we would like to hear your feedback about whether local areas feel they have the capacity, resources and skills to take these forward and use them themselves, or whether there are areas that they would need support. And as a final note, these resources have been co-produced through the work with Inverclyde and we want to keep the co-production theme going. We are more than happy to hear feedback from you on how you find these resources, what's helpful, and what could be tweaked to be of greater use or relevance. and you'll find our contact details on the web pages. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Megan. I just have quite a specific question that's come through on the chat function. It's whether the workbook, is that available to share as well? Is that part of the resource?
The data sources workbook, yeah, that is on the website available now, and it is not populated with data, it's populated with the source of data and where you can go and find it locally.
That's great, thank you very much. Okay, thanks again, Megan. I'll hand over now to Gena Howe from Glasgow City Council, who's going to be talking about the approach they've taken.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Gena Howe, and I'm the lead for child poverty at Glasgow City Council. So just thank you for joining us today. And although I'd like to start just by saying that although the focus of this presentation is in data, that this work, the Understanding Child Poverty work, has always been about helping us at the local authority to understand the depth of poverty in Glasgow, and as a way to try and be able to understand the interventions that are being taken. So if we can move on to slide 2, please. Just a wee bit of background. As sort of touched on by Megan and John earlier, for me, when taking up the role just at the end of 2018, one of the first areas I'd looked at was statistics. So what percentage of families living in relative poverty in Glasgow? Now, I'm sure you'll all agree with this. There's so many statistics out there, and each of them have got slightly different percentage levels, and some of them we don't have for some of the areas that John mentioned as well. And one of the main issues that when we were looking at each of these statistics that are available is that we can't measure any interventions against them because they're national statistics. And just with the impact of welfare reform and obviously now the impact of COVID, you know, we were trying to think, well, you know, even if you are taking activities to reduce child poverty, how are we going to know if it made a difference for our families? Now that conversation led to a discussion at our Child Poverty Governance Board about data that the Council holds, and our Executive Director of Finance at that point approved the work with the Centre for Civic Innovation. Now the Understanding Child Poverty work, it sort of required a whole team of us really, and we brought together different skill sets from right across Council departments. We collated a number of data sets from, you know, from education, the CMIS data, from housing benefit and council tax reduction data. We also looked at sort of what were kinship carers data. So we were trying to gather all the information that the council holds for children and families. And the housing benefit council tax reduction data, that provided quite a rich data set for analytical purposes, as in order to access eligibility for housing benefit or council tax reduction, you provide all sorts of information on your income and your family composition. And what that meant for us when we began to work through this is that we then had information whether it was a lone parent household, if the person was working, if they were unemployed. We also had information about their income, whether that was income from welfare benefits or wages, the ages of children, if anyone in the house had a disability. And as Hannah touched on at the beginning, we could then match that against those priority areas, so large families, mothers under 25, and so on. Now, unfortunately, as always, there's limitations to data. So we were unable to record information for our BME communities, as it's not mandatory to provide this information when you're claiming benefit. So we checked with colleagues in NHS, HSCP to see if anybody else held this level of information, and they didn't. So it meant for the purposes of this report, although we could outline each of those priority areas, we couldn't for our BME communities. However, we went ahead and produced the first report, and that was February 2020, so it was just before the pandemic hit, and that gave us our baseline figure. And we published that 2020 report with our Year 2 Local Child Poverty Action Report on the 25th of February. And again, that captured the details of about 36,000 children in Glasgow. If I can move on to the next slide, please. So this is about poverty thresholds, and I'll just spend a wee minute on this. And really, if anybody's looking for any more information out with this event, I'm happy to discuss this. Now, first of all, the figures are before housing costs. And in order to establish the depth of poverty, we looked at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation, the OECD and the Poverty and Inequality in Scotland report, and it was the 2018 report. And at that point, it provided the median income levels for 2 family compositions, and that was a single parent, 1 adult, 1 child under 14, a couple, 2 adults and 2 children under 14. And from this, we built a number of household compositions to understand the sort of de-equivalised income and set the poverty thresholds. All of the team worked on this. So this was the various data sources coming together, and although they all currently sit in isolation, by bringing them together, it allowed us to gain some really powerful insights. There was lots of data analytics. There was, data pre-processing, cleansing data, data sets, all of that to ensure the accuracy of the data. We also had a welfare rights officer who checked, double-checked, triple-checked to make sure that the income details that we held in our systems were correct. And to make sure that that had a true reflection of how much money people actually received each week, each month. If I can move on to slide 4, please. So although we did this in 2020, February 2020, we then updated the brief to run the same report and use the same methodology, but at this time it was about understanding the impact of the pandemic. And as you'll see, what we were really looking to understand was how had COVID impacted our families that were receiving benefits. Were there new families that were new to us that weren't there previously? How many families that were currently on the report before were no longer there? How many people had a drop in their income? And that's what we wanted to understand, to just look at, and we also brought in the universal credit data at this point as well. We can just move on to the next slide, please, which is about priority groups. So again, as Hanna spoke about, set out Scottish Government, Every Child, Every Chance, and discussed earlier, we looked at each of the priority groups. And we also added kinship carers and the children under 6, so we could look at the impact of the new Scottish Child Payment. And if we move on to the next slide, so there's a caveat, as always. The data captures details for families with liability for council tax and that are currently claiming council tax reduction. So it's not all families, because not all families will claim council tax reduction, and not all families will be in a household where mum or dad has a liability for council tax. But it's certainly captured enough, because the first report, it was 36,000 families, and this second report, it was 35,540 children. So we knew, although it didn't capture everybody, it certainly captured enough to allow us to understand child poverty in Glasgow. So key questions answered. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So we've 63,855 households in Glasgow where someone's claiming child benefit. And there's roughly about 106,745 children in those households. And that's the same as the pre-COVID report, not a huge difference there. But from those 63,000 households, we know that 19,650 of those households claim assistance with housing benefit or council tax reduction, and that's where those 35,540 children are. So again, it's relatively similar to the pre-COVID report. Although what was really interesting for us, although the numbers are very similar, it's not the same families. There's thousands of families that have been moved out of poverty since the last report, and equally we've had thousands of new families appear in the report that weren't there before. But I'll cover that in a wee bit more detail later on. Now, from those 19,500 families, we know that from those poverty thresholds that they and their income, that 15,346 of them are living in relative poverty. And that's an increase from the 2020 report. So we've got an additional 2,500 children now living in relative poverty since the pandemic. And again, that works out, just using this data, is about 26% of families. Now, we know more about the families than sort of what I'm going over today, but this is just to sort of give you an overview of the types of information that we captured. So if we move on to slide 8, please. And again, when we spoke about earlier, because we were looking at income, we looked at those families that were employed and those families that were unemployed. And we'd seen an increase since the 2020 report for families with at least one adult in employment. However, it also included 344 families that had lost their job in the 12 months since we'd first run the original report. So as you can see, there's about 6,792 children in households where there's at least one adult in employment, and there's 21,203 children where there's no adults in employment in the household. And what we could also evidence from that was the depth of poverty for those families. So what did we mean by that? We meant that we knew that those poverty thresholds and who was above and below, and that for families out of work, they're about £122 per week below the poverty threshold, and that's increased by £10 since the last report. And it sort of gives us an average of about £115 per week for our families that are below that poverty threshold. So for us, when we're beginning to think about the types of interventions that can support families to lift them out of poverty, you know, just having that understanding of how deep that depth of poverty is for them and how difficult it must be. There's also about 1,000 families with nearly 2,000 children in the first report that their income's actually reduced during the pandemic, and we could sort of track that, and we're beginning to see that emerging picture of families being worse off since the pandemic. And if we move on to slide 9, please. Focus on new families. See, when I'd mentioned earlier that although the numbers are sort of relatively the same, we've got about 3,143 families with almost 5,500 children that are new. So they weren't on the report before and they'd not claimed before. And what was really startling about these 3,143 families is that we could immediately see that despite being new to claiming assistance for council tax reduction, that they're right below that poverty threshold. In fact, 87% of them were below the poverty threshold. And when we broke that down further, we could see the numbers of families living in work poverty, where there was 844 households with 1,500 children, and they were £77 per week below the poverty threshold. So again, that theme emerging and coming through, you can see that families are much worse off and really struggling to make ends meet. And if we move on to slide 10, please. When I'd spoken about those families moving in and out, and I'd said that it's not the same families, I'd sort of mentioned that although the numbers have remained the same, what we looked at was those 5,522 children that are no longer on the report. So we're wondering, where are they? What happened to them? You know, and how had the family's income changed that they were no longer entitled to council tax reduction or housing benefit. And what was really interesting is that we sampled a number of cases. In fact, we sampled hundreds and hundreds of cases. And what we could see is that more than 50% had actually gained employment, or in most cases, they'd increased their hours. So we looked at the types of jobs they were in, and it was mainly frontline jobs. So even during the pandemic, you know, these organisations were still open, and our families had sort of increased their hours as a result of that, and that in turn meant they were no longer entitled to benefit because they'd managed to increase their earnings. And it was good to be able to analyse that data and understand that data and that level of detail. If we can move on to the next slide, which is about universal credit. Now, unfortunately, you know, the pandemic, we've seen a huge dramatic increase in families claiming universal credit. There are 14,579 children in households that are now receiving both universal credit and council tax reduction. 92% of them are living in relative poverty and below the poverty threshold. And that's with the UC top up, because we included that in the income thresholds when we were going through it as well. And we know as well, for those mums under the age of 25, they're receiving less benefits for simply being younger. And we've got about 1,000 children living in households with a mum under the age of 25. And for those mums, they're £133 a week below the poverty threshold. So if we move on to slide 12, I've just picked one of the priority groups. I'm just conscious of time. So we had data on each of those priority groups, so large families, children under 1, families with disability. But what was really stark for Glasgow was the number of lone parents. It's our largest group. There's 17,500 children living in households with one parent. This has increased since the pandemic, an increase of 1,650 since the last report. And for those families, they're £110 per week below the poverty threshold. And it just sort of, again, this data provided us with information just to know the impact of the pandemic, but also just the sheer scale and depth of child poverty in Glasgow. So just to wrap up, just the next slide, although I think it says questions. There's so many potential ways that we could work together to support families by using data to either target interventions or to maximise uptake of benefits. What I would say is that GDPR, because we're using this information from the benefit system, we're prevented from actually going and contacting people, even though in the first report we know that there's over 3,000 families not receiving either education maintenance allowance, free school meals or school clothing grant. We know who they are and we know what their income is, but we're actually, GDPR prevents us from going and telling them about that. So we're currently engaging with DWP, as is I think lots of the different leads across each of the 32 local authorities. I think COSLA are also involved about the current arrangements and data sharing arrangements between the local authorities and DWP. Because I think we all want the same thing. Everybody, we share the same ambition to lift families out of poverty, you know, and using data can be one way to do that. So thank you very much for your time today, and I'll just hand back to Hannah.
That's great. Thank you so much for that, Gena. I've just got not a straightforward question, but a question that's directed to you. So I'll just cover that first, and it relates to GDPR. Is there anything else in terms of the way you use the data? Were there obstacles in relation to GDPR, not necessarily in terms of what more you could have done, but just in terms of what you actually did? Could other areas do what you did without GDPR being an issue?
Yes, because what we did is, although we took the data, we then anonymised that so that it was for analytical purposes. And we did engage with DWP to see if we could do more, you know, because obviously the first report highlighted those gaps on the 3 education benefits. But no, we were allowed to use it for the purposes of analysing the data.
Great, thank you very much for that. So we've got a few more questions coming through. So the first one is from Margaret Lynch, and it's for Megan, and it's just what is being done differently in Inverclyde as a result of the data project. Is that something you can shed any light on, Megan?
I'm not sure if anyone from Inverclyde is on the line, but so when we asked them to reflect on what was done differently, there were the 3 key messages, I think, and that was one, that they had really developed networks, stronger networks that were working together to look at child poverty rather than it just being the responsibility of maybe one department or one team, and that was based on a much deeper shared understanding of everybody's role in it. And the second was that they felt that they were more confident in their priorities that they selected. They could evidence why what they had said was a priority was in fact local need, and got greater agreement on their priorities. And then the next one was, it was actually after the second workshop, we did a session on reflecting, and I don't think I'll get the wording correct here, but it was something like, I feel like we've been trying to hit the targets and miss the point. And it was just that reminder to move away from thinking about the targets and really focus in on the families and what's going on for the families. What does it feel like for these families, and what can we do to best support the families? Inverclyde can probably provide more concrete examples of what's changed, but that would be what we have had fed back to us just now.
Thanks very much, Megan. Okay, we have quite a specific question for you, Gena, and again it's from Margaret, and it's of the families who were no longer receiving benefit but had increased income due to their increasing their hours of employment. Do you know whether their total income increased or decreased or stayed the same? It's quite a detailed one.
Yeah, so their total income increased as a result of an increase in their wages, because they increased their hours for those families that we, well, for 50% of those families. There was the other breakdown, you know, some people had moved out of local authority area and things like that, but the vast majority had increased their income. And we were able to track that because they'd actually reported a change in their circumstances. So we were able to understand that it was that change in circumstances was as a result of increasing their earnings, that then moved them out. They no longer qualifying for council tax reduction.
Okay, thanks very much, Gena. Okay, well, we don't have any more questions through on the chat function, so please, anybody, if you have any questions, please go ahead and type those just now. In the meantime, I suppose I've got a bit of a question for the speakers. I suppose it's more of a general theme, but we know that coronavirus has had a massive impact. We think coronavirus has had a massive impact on child poverty, and I just wonder, John in particular, do you think that's something? I suppose when will the national data be able to give us an insight into the impact that that's had, and what can local partners do to try and understand the impact that it's had on child poverty locally?
Yeah, I mean, that's important to recognise, Hannah. There's a time lag in the national data. So the national data never refer to the year in which it's published. It refers to previous years when that data is collected and processed and then released later. So we're going to begin to get insights in the year ahead of the impact of COVID. But again, the best data for impact is the types of data that Gena is talking about. When you're really drilling down with that local data and you're really understanding exactly who not only loses, but to some extent benefits from COVID as well, which seems an odd thing to say. But I was really struck with Gena's slide when she pointed out that some frontline workers that had extra work during the managing COVID time over the last year or so had managed to move themselves out of poverty. That type of intelligence is the type of intelligence you can only get when you really have the access to the local data and then the ability to scrutinise that and reach these conclusions. And of course, it still raises questions, because we think as we move beyond COVID or in the later stages of COVID, it perhaps might be the case that these same frontline workers that Gena identified might not be getting the same level of employment as things begin to settle down. So it might be a transition, a temporary transition out of poverty. So I think a lot of questions about the extent to which the national data will serve as well locally, which goes back to the general theme of what we've talked about this morning. The right way for us, the richest way, the most useful way for us to understand the impact of COVID is to work with that data that's at our fingertips, if only we've got the capacity to do so. Thanks, Hanna.
That's great. Thanks very much, John. Okay, so we have a question through from Claire Coburn, and Claire's asking, the provision of universal supports like baby boxes and free school meals are fantastic, but can create challenges locally in terms of identifying families experiencing poverty. And she asks, do any of the speakers have advice on how to fill in this missing data? Does anyone want to take that on?
It's Gena. Hannah, I think, Claire, thank you for that question. I think it's a really good question. What we also did was track the impact of the newest child payment for those families that we know, but we don't have data from Scottish Social Security where we can look and see. So unlike education grants, where we're able to see these families are entitled and then check our systems, are they getting it? You know, we know these families were entitled to Best Start grant, you know, Best Start grant foods, you know, in the different new Scottish child payment. But there is that gap, Claire. So we've recently reached out to Scottish Social Security. We've got a small working group to try and work together to look at some of the issues and how we can both complement each other's work, but certainly don't have an answer just now. So happy if anybody else wants to comment. Thanks.
Anybody else want to come in on that?
No, again, I'm now like a broken record. That, you know, it's back to that. What Glasgow is able to do, what Glasgow is trying to do, is the way we get around these solutions. There does seem a bigger issue about GDPR, which is really important, absolutely important. That, you know, you protect people's data, but we're beginning to see it's a block in making changes. You know, and it's not designed to be a block. So I think the types of conversations that Gena's talking about, again, about, you know, working with the Social Security to see if there's a way around that. These are really important that we have these conversations, because we have the means to make a difference. And what we have is we have an administrative block that's preventing some of these impacts being impactful. So I think some of our priority has to be in, you know, overcoming that. And I very much hope that the work that Gena's doing with Social Security might be a way through that, that we can start to target the people or get the resources to the people that we've already targeted.
Okay, thanks, John and Gena. We have a question from Christine Begg, and she's asking, is there any data collected on families using food banks? So I wonder who's best placed to take that. I might pick on you again, Gena, just to ask whether you looked at food bank data as part of your work.
We did. So, and what, I don't know if one of my colleagues is listening, but we engaged with the Trust. So at the minute, they don't capture data as in, is it somebody first time, is it a repeat, is it so the data that they capture, we were unable to use that. Now we've recently, and I mean recently as in Friday, reached back out to Trussell to say, is this something that they could start to look at, just because food insecurity is reported, you know, repeatedly, and we were saying, can we understand from the food bank's perspective, you know, can we understand the level of child or families accessing this service, so that we can try and map service provision and just understand where those gaps are and how we can support them. But at the minute, Hannah, my understanding is no, they don't actually capture it in an individual, you know, household name, address type of thing. They just and also they don't always capture whether or not the individual has children.
Okay.
That's.
Can I come in there as well?
Yeah, go for it, Megan.
Yeah, so I was just say that food banks, where some of the local partners that we engaged with in the process in Inverclyde, and I think it's very dependent on how the individual, either local network or individual service itself, is set up to what information they gather, but that the depth of the qualitative information that they were getting from people using their services was something that struck us as being vital for us to understand locally. And yes, they might not have quantitative data, they might not know, you know, how many children were in the family, if there were any children in the family, but they were recording information that was very valuable to be understood locally.
Just to add a little bit to that as well. So we have a national estimate of food insecurity, which is data drawn from the Scottish Health Survey. Again, like so much of the national data, it can't be disaggregated locally to provide a local estimate. But the three questions that are asked, which are you know, three from a longer suite of indicators that can be used to estimate food insecurity, could be mimicked if there was that belief locally that we wanted to collect these data to have an insight into food insecurity. The food bank issue is interesting because the Trussell Trust, of course, are only one of the providers of food bank. They are the largest food bank providers, but they're also independent food bank providers. And there's a complex landscape out there with food insecurity, because it's not just food banks, there's also larders, there's also pantries, and there's also community supermarkets, all of which are independent, some of which are even community-based, and certainly collecting data wouldn't be a priority for them. So I think whatever type of data we can get from food banks might be useful, but it undoubtedly will be partial, because it's such a complex landscape in terms of who's trying to provide or who's delivering actions to tackle food insecurity. So lots of organisations working there, not just the Trussell Trust, and all of them have different routes of access, and none of them, I would guess, would be collecting systematic data that will give us a keen insight into the nature of food insecurity.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone, for that. Okay, we've got another question through from Joanna Buick, and she highlights, she says there's two problems for Orkney which relate to population size. one is the capacity in organisations locally to deal with data, and the other is data accuracy and the identifiability of low-income families in small populations. And she says we have insufficient expertise to gather data and to analyse it. And she asks, is there any central resource that could help us with data analysis? Megan, I don't know if you're in a position to answer that one in terms of the support that Public Health Scotland can offer.
Yeah, it's something that we're working on. It's a key part as to how Public Health Scotland, as a relatively new organisation, are looking to reshape ourselves, is how we provide support locally where it's needed. So we're working on across the organisation on what our local offering is going to be, and we're reaching out to local areas. And actually launching these resources today, we put out the package to a few critical friends from different local authorities, and one of them was in Islands. Forgive me, it wasn't me who sent out the packages to the area, so I can't remember where exactly it went, but some of our feedback was really helpful in helping us think about how we can ruralify it, I think was the word that they used, and make it more user friendly for people from rural areas and islands especially. It's definitely something we're looking at. We haven't finalised what our offer is going to be, but there will be a local offer from Public Health Scotland to support local areas.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Megan. Okay, we have a few more questions. It says, what advice can you offer to local authorities to allow them to require or encourage those they provide funding to encourage them to disaggregate their data to capture families living in poverty and to get a bit more information about whether they're in the priority groups? So I suppose that the question is around when you're funding organisations to deliver services, is it legitimate and is it useful to ask them to gather data on their service users in terms of income and characteristics and whether they fall into one of the priority groups? Is that something you've been doing in Glasgow? Gena, do you ask for that kind of information from organisations delivering services?
Not always, Hannah. So I think there's a couple of challenges with that. So I think the first one is sometimes for our third sector colleagues, just sheer capacity. You know, they maybe not have the resource or the systems to do that. So, and I think, you know, and for them that can be quite a challenge. What we did do, so I know that my colleague Gary Devine had spoke about our financial inclusion support officer project in schools. Yeah. We did, when we were working with our financial inclusion providers, we did ask them, we sat down and did a conversation right at the beginning of the project, and I was saying it's really important for us to understand who's accessing these services within our families and within those priority groups, you know, large families, mothers under 25. So we did agree with them at the very onset of this project that they would capture that level of detail and they would share that with us. And what we were saying to them, we would then track that, you know, against the poverty threshold. But not only that, we were then allowed to sort of put in place referral pathways so that for employability, access to digital, and also fuel. So there was a sort of, and it's still ongoing, so it was a joint piece of work, and there was buy-in at the beginning. It's something that we're currently working with our third sector colleagues on, because sometimes we don't need that level of detail, and it's more about just the work that they're doing and how they're supporting families. But I think for things like employment, when we're trying to track, you know, what are the barriers for families moving into employment, and to try and get right underneath it, then sometimes it is helpful to have that sort of level of detail. So yes and no, got it for some, but not all, Hannah. Thanks.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you, Gena.
Can I just follow that up? Sorry, Hannah.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
It was just to say that it was something that was discussed a lot in Inverclyde and reflected on, you know, what does this data tell us and how can we get more from it? And I think that's where the shared understanding really pays out dividends, because asking you know, funded providers, funded services to provide data when they feel like it's just data for the sake of data isn't going to get you anywhere. Whereas if they have that understanding of what that data can add and how it can be used to better support those families, because you need to remember that these services are there to support the families, that's what they want to do. So if they understand why adding a box on data collection isn't just about adding another piece of data to be gathered, it's about better targeting services, then I think that's sort of key to making those small changes.
That's great, thanks very much. And sort of on that vein, kind of, we've got a comment from Kirstine Begg, who's saying how interesting this is, and that she's a family nurse working with teenage first-time parents, and just highlighting that they do collect data as part of that programme, and not just on income. So I suppose the more conversations that are had at local level, hopefully the more data and information that will come forth to help build a more accurate picture. So we don't have any more questions at the moment. We're getting very close to the end of our allotted time anyway. Do any of the speakers want to make? Is there anything that you want to say before we finish up today? No? Okay, that's great. So can I just say thank you so much to our speakers. That's been really, really enlightening. I found it absolutely fascinating. And thanks very much as well to Lynn Sharp, who has provided the support with the technical side of things. If you have any questions that didn't get answered, then please do email me, and we'll be sure to follow up with those and get an answer to you. And we'll also be sharing the slides, the materials that have been discussed, and a recording of this webinar as well, so you can watch it again or share with your colleagues. Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, and I'll sign off now. So goodbye.